They say that silence is just music waiting for its cue. But the silence that fell over Harmony Creek the day Miss Cora Mae Jenkins died wasn't waiting for a thing. It was a thick, heavy thing, like wet velvet draped over the town's heart. Miss Cora hadn't just led the choir at the First Baptist Church for 40 years. She was the sound of this place. Her voice, a high, clear river of faith, was the thing that held everything, from the potlucks to the town council meetings. Together, she was found in her garden, hands dirt-stained, one perfect white rose clipped and resting in her lap, looking peaceful as a saint who'd just finished her earthly chores. The doctor called it a sudden heart failure, but everyone in Harmony Creek knew better. Her heart didn't fail. It just got tired of holding all the music. Miss Cora had no immediate kin, which meant the funeral arrangements fell to the church deacons and the choir members. I'm Lily Mae, and I was the newest, youngest soprano, barely 25, and now I felt the weight of that silence more than anyone. Maybe it was because I hadn't known her long enough to take her for granted, or maybe it was because I was the one who found the little key. It wasn't in her purse, or on a chain around her neck, but tucked inside the small, silver locket she always wore. The one she said held a picture of her favorite hymn. The key was tiny, iron dark, and cold against my palm. I slipped it into my pocket without thinking, mostly out of respect for her privacy, figuring it unlocked something small like a jeweler box or a diary. I didn't realize I had just picked the lock on 40 years of Harmony Creek's history. The wake was a blur of casseroles, whispered condolences, and a terrifying lack of song. Even the preacher, bless his heart, spoke in a tone more suited to a library than a pulpit. The whole town, 75 souls strong, stood around waiting for someone to start the music, but Miss Cora had taken the maestro's baton with her. Everyone was walking on eggshells around the heavy, dark piano in the corner of the fellowship hall. It felt wrong, like a bird's cage left open with no bird to fly out. The biggest silent figure of all was Mr. Silas Croft. Silas was a quiet man who owned the oldest cotton farm outside of town and never came to church, but he always showed up at the end of every funeral, standing in the back shadow near the doors, hat in hand. He and Miss Cora had shared a strange, unspoken tension for years, not anger, but a kind of deep, knowing sadness that passed between them every time they crossed paths in the grocery store. He didn't speak to anyone, just nodded once toward the casket and left before the final benediction. My curiosity about the key grew louder than the silence. The funeral was done, the ground was settled, and Miss Cora's little clapboard house stood empty under the old oak tree. I couldn't shake the feeling that the key belonged to that house. I waited until sunset, when the cicadas started their evening chorus, and walked the dusty road. The house smelled faintly of rosewater and polished wood, a scent as comforting as a hymn you know by heart. I tried the key on the front door, the back door, and a couple of cabinets, but nothing fit. Frustrated, I went to the parlor where the piano sat, draped with a crocheted shawl. I ran my fingers along the black and white keys, and that's when I saw it. A small, almost invisible brass lock built into the side of the bottom keyboard drawer. It was meant to keep sheet music safe, maybe, or old teaching notes. The little iron key slid in like it was meant to be there and turned with a soft click that echoed unnaturally loud in the empty room. The drawer didn't hold sheet music. It held one single wooden cigar box, carved with the initials EL. I lifted the box out. It was heavy, not with silver or jewels, but with the weight of paper. Inside, tied with a faded blue silk ribbon, was a stack of letters and a single sepia-toned photograph of a handsome young man with earnest eyes and a smile that seemed too bright for Harmony Creek. The man was not Silas Croft. I took the box home, my heart doing a nervous little jig against my ribs. Reading someone's private mail felt like walking into their bedroom uninvited, but the sheer secrecy of the whole thing compelled me. The letters were dated from the early 1940s, right before the war, and they were all signed Eli. They weren't just love letters. They were raw, passionate declarations written in a looping, urgent script. Cora, my dearest, this town is a cage designed by God to keep good singers from soaring. But you and I, we were meant for Broadway, not the county fair. Eli was a musician, a dreamer who wanted to take Cora, his golden throat, to New York City and make them both famous. He saw a future bigger than Harmony Creek. The letters told a story of secret meetings by the river, late-night promises under the moon, and a plan to run away together the night after the annual Harvest Festival choir performance. The conflict was palpable. Cora, bound by duty to her aging mother and her place in the church, and Eli, burning with the ambition of the outside world. The last letter, dated August 12, 1943, was the one that stopped my breath. It was frantic, scrawled on thin paper. My train leaves at midnight from the depot. Don't miss it. If you don't come, Cora, I can't come back. The war will swallow me, and I'll never forgive myself for not trying to save your song. Meet me, Eli. I was suddenly looking at Miss Cora not as the unflappable choir leader, but as a young woman at the edge of a great cliff, choosing between her song and her home. What had happened that night? Why had she stayed? The piano drawer offered no answers beyond that. I looked at the photograph again. Eli's eyes held a fierce light. He was the antithesis of the quiet, duty-bound life Cora had lived. His very image was a scandal hidden in plain sight. I felt I had to talk to someone. But who? The older choir members saw Miss Cora as a saint. To suggest she was poised to run off to a sinful city with a man named Eli would be blasphemy. I decided to start small. Mrs. Betty Tanner, the church historian and the oldest living member, was the only one who might remember 1943, though her memory was patchy. I brought her a fresh peach cobbler. Mrs. Tanner, I began casually, did you ever hear tell of a fellow named Eli around town back before the war? Mrs. Tanner stopped chewing her cobbler. Her eyes, usually faded and cloudy, sharpened with a sudden, startling focus. Eli, she whispered, the name catching on her breath like a burr on wool. Why, he was the only boy who ever saw the fire in Cora's heart, not just the light. Handsome as the devil and played the blues on a trumpet like an angel. She paused, stirring her coffee. He left, dear, just up and vanished. Said he was going to make a name for himself, and when he came back, he'd take Cora with him. She waited by that window for 6 months. 6 months of Sunday afternoons. But what happened that night? The night he left? I pressed, trying to sound innocent. Mrs. Tanner looked away, her gaze settling on a sun-drenched spot on the floor. The war took him. That's what we heard. A telegram came eventually. Nothing more was said. Cora just stopped speaking his name and started singing louder than anyone else to drown out the silence he left behind. The train never stopped that night, Lily Mae. It just rattled on past the depot, and he wasn't on it. Her story contradicted Eli's letter. He was supposed to be on the train waiting for her. I went back to the letters, sorting them by date. There was a gap, a whole year, between the frantic meet me letter and the next piece of evidence, which was a folded newspaper clipping tucked into the bottom of the box. It was a small item from a New York paper, reporting the death of a rising jazz trumpeter named Elijah L. Maxwell E.L. He had died in a fire at a recording studio. The date on the clipping was February 1944, after the August 1943 letter. But how did Harmony Creek hear about it? And why did Mrs. Tanner say the train never stopped? The story felt manipulated. The more I learned, the more I noticed Silas Croft. He wasn't just silent. He was observant. At Miss Cora's estate sale, I saw him pick up a cracked ceramic bowl she used for kneading bread, hold it for a long moment, and put it back down, a look of profound sorrow crossing his face. I knew I had to speak to him, the man who stood outside the music but understood the silence better than anyone. It took 2 days for me to gather the courage to drive out to his farm. It was remote, dusty, and silent, a mirror of the quiet he carried. He was sitting on his porch swing, whittling. He didn't look up when I pulled up, just kept carving the wood. "Lily Mae," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You've come about the box, haven't you?" I froze, the cigar box suddenly feeling like a bomb in my trunk. "How did you know about the box, Mr. Croft?" I asked, walking up the steps. He stopped whittling, laying the knife and the half-carved bird on the railing. "I didn't know about the box. I knew about Eli. And I knew about the silence that started the day he was meant to leave. Cora and I, we were just good neighbors who carried the same piece of history." Silas didn't need prompting. He told me the real story, or at least the part he knew. Eli wasn't just a musician, Lily Mae. He was a black man in a strictly white church town in 1943. His music was gospel, but his soul was jazz. Cora's love for him was a dangerous thing back then. The town elders, they weren't worried about her running away. They were worried about the scandal of who she was running with. He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the distant fields. "I was Eli's best friend. I was there that night. The elders, they got to the train conductor, paid him a handsome sum to skip the depot. Eli was running down the track, trying to flag it down, thinking Cora had stood him up. The wedding to Clara was muted, cloaked in the shadow of the recent tragedy. John went through the motions, a handsome, hollow figure. He and Clara moved into the big house, the silence within its thick walls amplifying his guilt. He was a good husband, dutiful and kind, but the fire had taken the joy out of him, leaving only an exhausted compliance. Clara, sensing his distance, grew quiet and fiercely devoted to propriety, seeing it as the only thing that could save their marriage. She never mentioned Lila, but John caught her looking at him sometimes, a flicker of suspicion in her calm blue eyes, as if she knew his heart was buried somewhere near the river. Their marriage became a silent, beautiful agreement. She would offer him stability, and he would offer her a good name, but neither would ever seek true warmth from the other. He kept the small wooden bird hidden in his safe, a secret, painful relic of the life that might have been. A year later, their son, Will, was born. Will was a miracle of squalling, demanding life, and for a short while, John felt a surge of genuine, unadulterated love. This new love, focused entirely on his son, provided a temporary truce in the war against himself. John threw himself into fatherhood, believing that if he could just make Will's life perfect, secure, and respectable, he could somehow justify the price he had paid. Will grew up to be steady, grounded, and utterly practical, inheriting his mother's calm nature. John loved him fiercely, but sometimes, looking into Will's contented eyes, John felt a wrenching sadness. His son had none of the reckless fire, none of the vibrant chaos that Lila had embodied. He realized that his choice had neutered his family line, ensuring that the next generation would also be safe, and therefore tragically incomplete. Years folded into decades. John ran the hardware store, became a pillar of the community, and watched his son go to college. His life was exactly what Mr. Hayes had promised. Successful, admired, and utterly without risk. But the stability that he had craved became a prison. He and Clara lived separate, polite lives under the same roof. The house was immaculate, the garden flawless, but the silence between them was enormous. John began to take long walks toward the river every Sunday afternoon, a habit Clara never questioned. He didn't go to the site of the fire, but to the small, unkempt patch of ground at the edge of the cemetery, where Lila's simple, unmarked grave lay. He never wept. He just stood there, letting the heavy, humid air remind him of the day he had traded passion for duty. This revelation twisted the story from a personal heartbreak into a town conspiracy. The silence wasn't just grief. It was complicity. I went back to Mrs. Tanner, not with Cobbler, but with the full truth now heavy on my tongue. I told her about Eli and the train, and the men who had stopped it. Her face turned ashen. "I didn't know the train didn't stop," she mumbled, fumbling with her shawl. "I just knew she was waiting and he never showed. The men, they just told us he'd backed out, that he'd been scared off. They were protecting us, Lily Mae. Protecting the church. Protecting themselves, Mrs. Tanner?" I corrected her gently. "They stole her choice, and they stole his life." I realized the men who had done this were probably still alive, still sitting in the front pew, still leading the church. The thought chilled me to the bone. The true conflict wasn't over a dead love. It was between the present and a past the town refused to acknowledge. I started looking at the men in the church with new eyes. Deacon Peter Wells, the most outspoken man in the council, was one of the few men of that generation still leading. His voice had the ring of authority and unquestionable righteousness. I watched him at choir practice, the few we held, trying to prepare for the memorial service, and saw the way he avoided looking at the piano. I started to understand that the true secret was a systemic one, woven into the fabric of the church. The cigar box held one last item, hidden beneath a false bottom. A tiny, folded piece of paper with handwriting that wasn't Eli's. It was Cora's. It read, "The Harvest Festival, August 12, 1943. Peter Wells, Joe Davis, The River Bend. God forgive them." It was a confession, a silent accusation, written in her own hand. It was the moment she knew the truth, or at least enough of it to assign blame. The memorial service was approaching. The deacons had decided on the hymns, and they were all slow, solemn things, lacking the fire Cora had always insisted upon. I knew I couldn't let her go out with a whimper. I had to use her music to tell her truth. I called Silas. He was the only person who understood the stakes. "I know who stopped the train," I told him. Cora left a list. Silas came to the church immediately. He wasn't surprised by the names. They built this town, Lily Mae, and they built that silence. You can't just tell people a secret they've been living a lie to protect. He was right. A spoken accusation would be dismissed as the fancy of a young girl. We needed proof that spoke louder than any of Peter Wells' sermons. I realized the answer was in the piano. The drawer wasn't just a hiding place. It was a confessional. Cora had locked the evidence into the very instrument that sustained her life. I started to inspect the piano more closely. It was an old upright and the lock was antique. I pulled on the drawer, wiggling it gently, and heard a faint, hollow sound from inside the main frame of the piano. Using a borrowed flashlight and a thin wire, I managed to dislodge another, smaller object from inside the piano's mechanism. It was a single, old, worn trumpet valve. It was brass, etched with a tiny, almost illegible monogram, E.L.M. It was Eli's. She had taken a piece of his music and buried it inside her own, a constant, physical reminder of the song that was taken away. I planned to use the trumpet valve and Cora's note during the memorial service. The choir, all of them, had to hear the story. I wrote a short, simple monologue about the nature of silence and truth, and I tucked it into my hymnal. I showed the note and the valve to the choir members one by one, starting with Martha, the alto who had sung beside Cora for 30 years. Martha didn't cry. She just got a look of grim determination in her eyes. "We sing her truth, Lily Mae," she said, her voice gravelly but firm. The day of the memorial service was humid and tense. The church was packed. Peter Wells gave a long, self-congratulatory eulogy about Cora's dedication to God and community. Silas sat in the back, watching me. When it was time for the final hymn, a somber, dirge-like piece, I walked to the center of the choir. I opened my hymnal, but I didn't read the words. "Before we sing," I began, my voice trembling but clear, "I want to share a piece of Miss Cora's heart." I pulled out the trumpet valve. This belonged to a musician named Eli. He loved Miss Cora, and she loved him. They planned to leave this town together, to take their music to the world. I paused, letting the information sink into the silence. Deacon Wells shifted uncomfortably in his pew. I told the true story, piece by piece. The promised train, the silenced love, the men who chose fear over joy. I didn't mention any names, but I looked directly at Deacon Wells and the few others who were of the right age. Miss Cora couldn't sing her full song here, not really. She sang the song this town demanded, and she locked her true song away, deep inside her piano. I lifted the small iron key. This key unlocks not a box, but a secret this town buried 40 years ago. And when a secret is that big, it stops the music. The atmosphere in the church was electric. People were turning, whispering, looking from me to Wells. Wells stood up, his face red. "This is not the time or place for slander, young lady. You are Deacon Wells was shouting, his face purple, but no one was listening. The music was too loud, too joyous, too true. He and the other two men named on Cora's note stood up and stumbled out of the church in disgrace, defeated not by an accusation, but by a song. Their legacy of control dissolved in the air like smoke. The song finished, and the applause started. Not the polite clap of churchgoers, but a roaring ovation from the congregation. The silence was finally gone, replaced by a raw, open, emotional sound. I looked back at Silas. He gave me a slow, sad, and relieved nod. The promise he had been forced to keep was finally broken, and he was free. After the service, I went back to Miss Cora's house one last time. I sat at the piano, the cigar box and the trumpet valve resting beside me. The secret had changed everything. The choir had found its fire, the town had found its courage, and I had found a deeper understanding of love and sacrifice. Miss Cora had planned it all, knowing that only after her death would the town be forced to confront its past. I decided to leave the trumpet valve and the letters with Silas. They were his story, too, a story of loyalty and silent suffering. He took them gently, his hands trembling, and just said, "Thank you, Lily Mae. Now, maybe Eli can finally rest." He looked years lighter, the tension that had held him taut for 40 years finally released. The choir still practices, but now we call ourselves the Cora Mae Ensemble. We still sing the old hymns, but we mix in some unexpected, joyful, and soulful tunes that Miss Cora would have secretly loved. We sing louder, with more feeling, knowing that every note is a small rebellion against the kind of silence that steals happiness. I took Miss Cora's place as the new leader, not because I have her voice, but because I have her story. And I refuse to let the train pass without stopping again. The biggest change came from the church itself. With the old guard gone, a new spirit of openness began to bloom. The truth about Eli and Cora was painful, but it was also liberating. It forced Harmony Creek to look at its foundation and decide what it truly valued: dusty traditions or genuine grace. I had the piano moved to the church hall, no longer draped in that crocheted shawl, but open for anyone to play. It was no longer a monument to a secret, but a stage for the truth. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear a faint, distant trumpet echo in the silence after I turn off the lights, a soft, bluesy note saying thank you and goodbye.